I am Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And we're paranormal specialists who live in the most haunted city on earth, Savannah, Georgia. Every day is Halloween in our line of work, so join us as we spin true tales of haunts, murders, and disturbing Savannah history. I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. Hey there, listeners. So if you are on the edge of wanting to become a parajunkie, let us just give you a few examples of why it might be a good idea.
Yeah, we're just going to shove you right over the edge.
Yes. So you see, when you become a parajunkie, you get to join a community of spooky, like-minded people who share their experiences. They support each other.
And there's so much more content for the parajunkies. When you're a parajunkie, you get exclusives. You get exclusive lives. You get to come with us on ghost hunts and investigations through our live broadcasts straight to the Patreon.
And then, of course, you're also helping to support us and to further this podcast. We are still only a year old technically, and we are in the very early stages of growing as a podcast. And the financial support definitely helps us a lot to make bigger and better moves, get better filming equipment, make this beautiful set that we're currently in. And that is all thanks to the Parajunkies.
And to finance things like trips to haunted locations all around the country, all around the world. We have our sights set on many haunted locations that the Patreon money will help us get to.
Exactly. So if you want to see us go to Aokigahara, you want to see us go to the Paris catacombs, definitely consider becoming a Parajunkie today.
And it's all ad-free.
Yes. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Most Haunted City on Earth. My name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And I'm Jack Fiddler.
Not Jack Fiddler.
Just go. Just say whatever comes. Just say whatever comes.
Good luck.
Well, all right then. Let's talk
Didn't
about.
end well for either of those people, by the way.
Yeah, literally. I'm like, well, on that note, welcome to today's episode. We are going to be talking about cannibals. So, at the very basics of it.
Right. A very specific
cannibal
or cannibal disorder. Evil
it's American
spirit.
pastime.
It is. So we're going to be talking about Jack Fiddler and Swift Runner.
And the Wendigo is at the core of both of their lives.
Wendigo.
Yes. And of course, the Wendigo is a term for an evil spirit that will possess you if you consume human flesh. So, and it is believed that it is a corrupting spirit. So, people can be possessed by it, just when they're very ill, it creates a lust for human flesh. Mm-hmm. And so, the first thing we were going to talk about was Jack Fiddler, who was a shaman, and he and I believe his brother were Wendigo hunters. And this was a fascinating thing. It was they would actually travel through, and I want to say this was the Algonquian, Alberta, Canada area.
That is correct. Yes.
Looking for people who were suffering from what they believed was Wendigo curse, and by the tenets of their faith, they oftentimes euthanized the people who they believed were going Wendigo, that were possessed. So this was and it was a practice where I believe in some cases the victims themselves, the people who were euthanized, were asking to be euthanized. They were actually, please don't let me become a Wendigo. Please, help me. I can feel it. I sense it. And they would go through it because there was also a ritual to it, because you have to treat the body a very special way. I believe you have to burn the body. I think there's a lot of elements that go into it, so that, because if you do not take care of the body after death, the Wendigo inhabits that body and becomes a physical and monstrous thing. So yeah, I find it interesting how very structured the belief system was in how to deal with Wendigos, that there was a practice that went into effect, and that apparently Jack Fiddler and his brother, I'm going to say it's Joseph.
I believe that is correct. Let me look into my notes.
These brothers, they actually went to...
Yep, it's Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph. Went to great lengths to ensure that the Wendigo does not plague the people. Wow. Which, of course, when Western or when European magistrates and people got involved, they weren't taking the story.
The mounted police did not do well with this.
They were not interested
no.
in this story because I think they came across in the last case, Jack Fiddler had performed this duty for an elderly woman. But to the authorities, it was just murder. It just looked like murder. It seemed like murder.
Yeah.
So they arrested Jack and his brother. And this is interesting because in varying stories, Jack Fiddler escapes or he gets out and hangs himself, away from the authorities. And that, raises all kinds of questions as to what was that process? Was he ensuring that he didn't die at the hands of the wrong, authorities, or was he actually lynched? Was did people set up a party, go out, find him, and hang him? Because it was a pretty heinous crime, and I want to say that his brother was also hanged. And this was like such an interesting thing because the idea that there was a trial of any type that involved talking about a Wendigo is fascinating, only to learn that it wasn't the first.
Right.
Only to learn that this was not the first time the authorities were dealing with native beliefs and how they structure themselves, and how behaviors of that structure make a cultural rift. Because in the Jack Fiddler case, he was being tried for basically doing his job.
Literally. That is the basics of it. It's they were in a time, and mind you, this is the 1800s. Obviously, there was no progressiveness at all. It was a very trying time because of the fact that they had no interest in even understanding where the native people were coming from with this belief system. They're like, murder is murder and that is it. Sorry, plain and simple. Instead of hearing out and listening to the fact that you're right, these people were reaching out and saying, hey, I would prefer to be, euthanized and that assisted.
And protected against this evil spirit, right? Exactly,
because they don't want to become something so heinous like Wendigo, because in their belief system, that is one of the worst things that you could become.
Well, and it's interesting because there are a lot of that indigenous belief structure that suggests the idea being that the good in you it goes on when you die. The good in you gets to go to the next plane, but the bad in you stays, and that is a corruptible and dangerous thing, and that the bad in you can form into a type of entity that causes illness and causes all kinds of things like that. And so in the case of the Wendigo, a lot of times there are people who've suffered. And in their suffering, they were ill. They sense that the amount of suffering that they're going through is darkening the good in them. Right. And when the good leaves, the suffering stays. The pain stays, the anger stays, the parts of you that are not, worthy of the next plane. It stays, and it in the case of these specific peoples, the Wendigo was a part of that. Was an idea that they don't want to leave behind this wicked thing, this darkening evil.
And I think it's also worth mentioning too, you know, it's I think the mounted police who are really in charge of the Jack Fiddler portion of this, which is not his name, by the way. His actual name is very much so not Jack Fiddler.
Right.
But that is the colonized name that he was given.
And it was the name that he kind of used in his dealings in a lot of ways, because that became the barrier was always, how do I deal with the white man? You know, how I deal with that structure, and being given names that become the commerce point.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think a big plunder is not understanding that he's a shaman, and
he was a shaman, yeah,
and how much it goes into to become a shaman. That is a very high status, because you have to go through grueling rituals and training and deep spiritual work to reach that point. I feel like a lot of people, when they read this story, and I think a lot of it has to do with the name that he was given. It has such a folkloric sort of name, like that Paul Bunyan sort of deal, where it almost dehumanizes him. But it's like, if you look at it from a perspective of like, this was an actual person, and how smart this person would have been, and how deeply, how spiritually enlightened, if you will, that this person had to be doing these things. It's like, why? You know, how was that not brought up? It's like,
although with that equal knowledge, being a Wendigo hunter also gave him carte blanche to do some damage if he really chose to, and we can't be we can't simply say, because of the shamanistic thing, that he might not have also been like the witch hunter of the European trade. If you're given the power to just look at somebody and say, you're a Wendigo, and then it's over, that person does not get to argue, does not get to, you know, so there was, I think, some of that notion that maybe he was just out there able to, you know, give the eye to anyone and be like, you're a Wendigo. It's like, oh no, there's no protection for you in that case. And that gave him a lot of power, you know, socially. He had a lot of social power because you know, if he saw Wendigo in you, the process was severe, and it was, you know, and that kind of brings us to this notion too, that it's like, oh, you know, that's a position of inscrutable power to have, and not to say that he did, just saying that there's room to believe, because we also have a tendency to hyper romanticize the notion of the indigenous people as pure noble. And that is, of course, because we spent a lot of time, you know, demonizing them. And as we come out, it's like, well, they're humans, you know, they were human beings, and human beings do have every foible and every noble trait. But that does bring us to the case of Swift Runner.
Very different.
Very different case. And I want to say that it was only like maybe 20 years before Jack Fiddler's arrest that that Swift Runner arrived on the scene. And Swift Runner was the first person hanged by the authorities in Alberta, Canada. And it's a bizarre story, because this story it's dark,
it's brutal.
And it kind of comes to this idea that you know, what do we believe in these kinds of situations? So the story simply goes that Swift Runner, who had a bit of a reputation for you know, being reckless, drinking a little much, not really functioning in his own society, takes his family, and it's like his wife, his children, his wife's mother, and his brother off into the woods during a winter in Alberta, Canada, to set up, you know, their homestead or whatever. And in the spring, he shows up and he's very distraught and he's very upset because the winter was too harsh. And he tells, he goes to I believe it's a Catholic monastery, and he basically goes and he says, my family starved over the winter. It was so brutal, so cold, it was so difficult that my family starved. And I believe he was Cree. And so he comes in and he's like, I'm so distressed, I'm so distraught. The priests are looking at him and they're like, starved, huh? You look kind of healthy. You look well fed for a person who survived a starving winter. So they're very suspicious of him, like right at the get-go. They're like, I'm sorry.
They're like, Daddy thick.
Yeah, right.
He was thick, though.
And he was, and he was because he was a big man. On top of that, he wasn't. Yeah, so he was robust and healthy, and they're like, you don't look like you're starved. And they have dealings with the Cree, and it turns out that winter wasn't difficult for the others. For the other indigenous peoples, they seem to be doing fine. The hunt was very good for them, and so there was just like your whole family starved to death.
8 people.
Yeah, 8 people in total.
8 people?
8. The number 8.
I was like, what are we talking about here?
One more than 7.
One more than 7. One less than 9.
Yes, one less than 9. So they basically investigate him. They arrest him. They investigate him. They try to get him to take him to the site, the campsite. And I think he gets them lost a couple of times when they go out, but they get him drunk.
They get him drunk?
It wasn't hard to do.
It wasn't hard to do. They get him drunk, and when he was drunk, he took him right to it.
Oh, no.
And so he takes him right to it, and what they find is horrifying.
Oh.
Absolutely horrifying. The bones of his family are picked clean.
Whoa.
Not just picked clean, but cracked open and the marrow sucked out of the bones.
Ooh.
They're like somebody with a tool popped these open. And then finally they find a pot full of human fat. Oh. And they're like, what did you do? And
what
so
did you do?
He uses the Wendigo defense. He claims that he had been possessed by an evil spirit, the Wendigo. And it forced him to want to feed on his family. Now, to make matters worse, one of the things that tipped the priests off and made them feel like they needed to get ahead of it was Swift Runner tried to get a band of children together to go back out into the woods with him. From the monastery, he was like trying to get a little party of people to go with him.
No,
and it's believed that it was just his incredible bloodlust, his hunger pangs for like human flesh.
Them little kitties looking nice and stew-like.
They're not going to fight. So
wow, that's crazy.
It's so crazy, and if I remember correctly, there was like a lobbying for shamans to have the remains, not to let, because he was sentenced to be hanged, and the process of hanging and disposing of the body, the indigenous people were like, hey, we need to do that. We need to take care of that. And there's no real record as to whether or not that happened. Some people think that he was hanged and buried, and then someone came and dug up his grave to do the ceremony that keeps the Wendigo from coming out. But I find it fascinating that the Wendigo was an issue. It was a problem. The Wendigo proved to be in 2 cases and ultimately 3 death sentences. A major part of court proceedings. I think you can actually find the Swift Runner trial transcripts.
Oh,
right.
And that's fascinating to me.
I will attempt.
Yeah, you can find some records of it from what I was able to see. You can find some records of it. A lot of it was not properly documented because it's like 1826 or whenever this happened.
79.
Was 79? Okay, yeah. A couple 50 years later. But, you know, it's...
Well, because Jack Fiddler was like 1906 was when he died. But he was a practicing Wendigo hunter, I think, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Before history is written, it's played. Before it's frozen in time, it's fought one shift at a time. Before it's etched in silver, it's carved in ice. What happens next will last forever. The Stanley Cup Final on ABC and ESPN Plus begins Saturday.
Of Swift Runners, you know, they would have overlapped.
So he didn't come and kill Swift Runner? Because I thought that's how this would end.
No.
Oh man.
No,
I thought this was gonna be like a
not everything in history.
He's a Wendigo. Let's kill him.
Not everything.
Well, I think that was the general consensus of the indigenous people was that they needed to take care of it.
Yeah.
But they couldn't get him away from the authorities, and so, like I said,
mounted police.
There's a lot of conjecture as to whether or not.
Sure.
And it may have been Jack Fiddler, for all we know, who dug up his corpse.
It was all in the same area, so it's very possible.
It's very possible.
But I want to say, hold on, let me look at my notes. I want to say that Jack Fiddler and Swift Runner were in different tribes.
They were. I'm
positive
that is true.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
However,
Yeah.
I think that Jack Fiddler had kind of carte blanche amongst many tribes.
You would think that the mounted police would be like, let's call the Fiddler Crab, get him over here with the snappers.
Fiddler Crab was a part of the First Nation. Swift Runner was a Cree. So
heard.
That's the problem. And you'll see that a lot with any type of Native American or, Native people belief systems and practices. They don't like to interlap with each other because there's different processions of what they need to happen.
Okay, so we all know in this room that humans are capable of absolutely nightmarish things. They can do whatever they really want in this world without feeling bad. Some of them very rarely can. So here's my question. Do we believe it's a Wendigo, or do we believe it's not a Wendigo and he was just a full-blown psychopath who wanted to kill and eat his family and stay thick and drink? Because I don't know what life was like back then. Obviously wasn't there, but if I got 8 members of my family, no pun intended, I'm not gonna think they're my first food source.
So there's a lot of questions of whether or not that is the case, because you're right, there are people that were psychopaths, but at that time, if you're thinking back into the mindset of indigenous people, they're always going to lean into their core belief systems, which are very, very heavily based in spirits and being in tune with the spirits around them. So there's even actually beliefs that Dahmer was possibly a Wendigo because of the fact that he ate his victims and stuff. No. I'm just saying.
No. Well, but
because of the region he was
if you wanted to look at that, we use the word psychopath. Psychopath could just be another word for Wendigo.
Right.
The concept being that what you claim to be the darkest parts of human nature are foreign to what we understand. What was the process? What was going on? Is there something in the brain? Was there a chemical? We come up with these words, but if it was a recognizable trait that you're like, oh, that person just went,
feral?
Feral, flesh crazy, you know, something to that effect. There is no difference between saying he had a psychotic break and he had an evil spirit attached to him.
Sure.
That becomes this notion of suggesting that Dahmer wasn't a Wendigo because, he was sick in the head. they literally think that the Wendigo is a sickness of the head. They think that the Wendigo is a malady,
a disease,
that causes this.
Mm.
And while there are the spiritual aspects, and of course the corpse rising and running around, those things are the notions beyond it.
Sure.
But there is an idea that what they were recognizing was some kind of peculiar and specific, because it's specific. It is eating human flesh, which by all rights should seem like it shouldn't occur to you.
Right. It does not come natural.
Ideally, it should not. Naturally occur to you. So somewhere along the line, they recognized a type of insanity that led to it. And when you think of remote and frozen and starving being conditions that could easily happen to you, because why would you live in the frozen tundra of the north when there are more temperate locations to go to?
Because it's pretty.
Well, because they have faith and dedication to a source.
Exactly.
But we are not experts by any stretch of the imagination in this field. It is just one of those fascinating things that came up, which is, by the way, there were cases, during a clash of cultures, during a time when there was this European advancement in the Canadian wilderness. Where they were finding these indigenous peoples whose practices included recognizing this sickness and this evil entity, this darkness, and what an interesting thing. And what's interesting to me was I think the first time I ever even heard this, maybe a decade ago or so, it just seemed like a little footnote, and I was like, these are interesting stories.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that there haven't been more movies or things like that. Maybe there are. Again, not experts.
Might be a Wendigo movie somewhere.
Oh, no, there's definitely. It's called Antlers.
That's it. Yeah.
There's Antlers. Ravenous is actually a Wendigo movie. There are movies that touch upon, but I meant literally a Jack Fiddler or a Swift Runner.
Sure.
Yeah.
Movie, yeah. That would be really dope movie.
And if you want to hear a more deep dive into like the Wendigo disease and stuff, and more about the actual Wendigo, go watch the Wicked that JT and I did a very long time ago.
It was actually September 2022. So just go to the episodes then.
Yeah, so go watch that.
It's only a year ago.
Right. But it's still very interesting. And it's much more of a deep dive into just that particular entity. We're looking at it more from a full wide gaze.
Right, and a culture clash kind of thing. We're not talking about the actual Wendigo. We're talking about how it was presented in these instances.
Right.
For sure.
I will say, though, I think there's just an overall, in general, not a very minute understanding of Wendigos, because
absolutely.
It's actually funny. When JT and I were on our honeymoon in Scotland, we went to see a production of Sleepy Hollow in the King's Theatre.
Very interesting.
It was a very weird production. Very beautiful, but weird. And Ichabod Crane, he was a ham.
But, he really was.
He should have been Sweeney Todd, honestly. But what was weird is they made it seem like Sleepy Hollow was being plagued by a Wendigo. They actually had did
they?
Yes. Did you not catch that?
I
they brought a whole Wendigo on the stage. They literally. I'm not kidding you, Jay.
Well, before this podcast, I didn't know what that was.
It was a 7 foot. I literally leaned over to you. I was
antlered,
I'm like,
beast.
is what the Scots think happens in America in Boston, Massachusetts, because Wendigos are not in Massachusetts, if you are wondering. That is a Canadian. And,
according to you, they're in Wisconsin or Milwaukee. Yeah, Milwaukee.
Well, that's
a lot closer to
that's
the
a lot
Yukon than you
closer.
think.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't say. I'm just saying there are some people who theorize that Dahmer was
I know, it was a joke.
because it's all in that Midwestern top portion
Yeah.
of the U.S. and
Minnesota and all that.
Yeah, that's where the Wendigo territory is, not Massachusetts. And so I was like, interesting take on thinking that Sleepy Hollow was plagued by a Wendigo, because that's not the MO of anybody in that show, which is just weird.
That is a strange take, absolutely.
But
There's
it was
only one spirit in the in the Sleepy Hollow tale, and that's the Headless Horseman.
Yeah, well, that was
Odd.
Yeah, so
Very odd.
they were trying to say the Headless Horseman was plagued by the Wendigo.
Even weirder.
Yeah, and they brought out this 7-foot-tall Wendigo creature, and it was a beautiful costume. If I had photos of it, we would insert it. But they did a gorgeous representation of the Wendigo. It was very creepy. But I was just kind of like, I think that was like the first time I ever witnessed. I was like, we have no comprehension of what this actually is.
Yeah.
Especially because Sleepy Hollow in general, nobody's eating each other. That would have made sense if they tried to plop a Wendigo in Sweeney Todd, because they are eating each other and saying Sweeney Todd is a Wendigo. But
to be sure, every culture actually has a very similar Wendigo curse.
Yeah.
The concept of eating human flesh leading to supernatural corruption, that is, I think, almost every culture. When you really think about it, I mean, a vampire is just a Wendigo. Ghouls, just Wendigos. Zombies, just Wendigos.
What we should do is, I should try to find maybe like a Native American expert, or just a person of Native American origin that's really, really familiar with the supernatural part of it, and have them on the show to talk about Wendigos and in detail.
If you could find somebody who's Cree,
yeah,
that would be, or Ojibwe, I believe, or Ojibwe. Sorry if I butcher that pronunciation, but that region of Native American, they're the ones who focus heavily on the Wendigo. So if anybody knows somebody, who is
hit us up, because I would love to have them on the show to talk about Wendigos.
I know
we can
have
get a real, like a non-internet, explanation of it.
Yeah, I know we have some Minnesotan people listening to this podcast. So if you know anybody. Or Canadians too. I think we have a few Canadians as well. So if y'all have anybody, send them our way.
Send them our way. Absolutely.
But overall, though, I mean, it's a fascinating story in just a folklore lens, because it's like it's so hard to wrap the mind around that this actually happened, and then when you hear it get very real,
right?
In a court case,
that's the whole concept. Is we understand as a belief, and we understand as as a cryptid, as a creature, as a physical being that roams and is out there, versus how it affects people's legal interactions.
Right.
It's like, how intriguing that this belief was strong enough to be attempted as a defense, and be used as an accusation. So, that's fascinating.
So I'm looking at the analytics right now. We have thousands of Canadian listeners, but the majority of them are from Vancouver, which is obviously not going to be.
No, it's not the right spot. Minnesota.
But we are we're deep in Toronto, which is what? That's something.
That's
there.
closer.
So all right, so our Toronto listeners, let's.
We're looking for Alberta. That's the heart of all this.
That's where we want to
Alberta. All right.
So you Toronto listeners, if you have friends that live in Alberta, first off, tell them to listen to the podcast.
Yes.
Then to ask if anybody has any friends who are Cree or First Nation, I guess, in that particular area. But yeah, it's also just baffling to me that it's still seen as a cryptid and not a demonic entity.
Well, and it's fascinating, because when we get down to those cryptids, there are several cryptids that don't fit in the cryptid line exactly, because even the Mothman is
It's iffy, but
is an iffy cryptid. But
we know you love Mothman.
It works to the advantage of people experiencing something strange that is abnormal out in nature or out in the world. But yeah, it is odd that there is the notion of the cryptid that is a Wendigo.
So why did they turn into it kind of bewilders me, or not bewilders, well, that's not the word. I don't know. I find it curious that Wendigo has this deer skull and these antlers when it's all about eating people, and deer is one of the number one things that are eaten up there, right? They're one of the number one food source. Them fish and other stuff.
What it is,
and so that's
exactly the reason why because
interesting.
It is the thing that is eaten by people. When it comes to representing the thing that eats people, it's about turning tables. It's about the thing consuming you. You are now the prey. So if you're the prey, then who is the hunter? And then because it's not the hunter is going to be something more fierce. It's going to be the thing that you've been preying on. And ideally the deer antlers and skull are an affixing. It's not the physical form of it. It is the presentation of an what is it? It's basically suggesting that
it's symbolic.
The symbolism being you are the hunted.
Okay.
And fear the thing. Feel the fear that the deer feels. Which makes a lot of sense because, and this is a fascinating thing because a deer with full antlers is a majestic creature. It is fantastically majestic, and it is my understanding that in the indigenous culture, the use of every bit of the hunt and ensuring that everything is honored and respected and revered, the Wendigo is a corruption of that. It is about the lack of reverence and the lack of of having any honor or having any goodness. So to have it be perverted in such a way.
It's also the thing that should never be eating humans.
Right, exactly.
Eating humans. I also had a question too. So last time we talked about the Wendigo, a year ago when we did the deep dive in the one from One to Wicked, a lot of people kept saying like, "Oh, you're not supposed to say the Wendigo's name or it shows up," and I'm like, to my understanding,
that's Bloody Mary stuff.
Well, no, but that's a classic. A lot of people say that you're not supposed to say Skinwalker. You're not supposed to say Wendigo. You're not supposed to say. And one of the big things is in a lot of these cases, we're not saying the name. We're not pronouncing it correctly, nor are we even privy to the actual name.
It's true.
I didn't even think about that.
Well, and it's also just to my understanding, at least. The Wendigo is attacking people who are already in the throes of getting there. They are sick. They are ill. So if you're like severely ill, maybe don't say it. But like, it's,
well, I mean, it's like lycanthropy, werewolf. It travels along the same notion of that transformation into beast, into creature, into monster. And it's only really relatively recently that a lot of people have jumped on that. Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, which is, in fact, more in ties with with Celtic beliefs and things of that nature. It is this notion that's kind of bled into a lot of different arenas, which is, it's where we get knock on wood. When you speak something, you're knocking on wood to dispel the hearing of the bad thing you've said, or the bad will that you're bringing yourself. If you speak anything ill, you are inviting it, is kind of a common superstition belief. But it's also worth examining as if you put that at the forefront of your belief structure, it probably is true.
Mm-hmm.
It probably is true. If you call upon a creature by its name, it'll come. I mean, you're not supposed to speak demon names for that exact same reason.
Yeah.
But a lot of that too, I think, you're absolutely right. It comes from these Celtic belief systems. And as a country that was taken over this area and Canada in general was very run through by European countries. You see a lot of our personal beliefs being pushed onto native beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily the truth. That's just our lens that we're seeing it through.
Like I recently saw an interview where a person an indigenous person was basically saying there is the insult of like saying spirit animal, because that became a big hot topic. It's like that's cultural appropriation. The bigger insult is foisting upon the indigenous belief structure the idea of spirit animal. Spirit animal is in fact a Western construct about the indigenous people's beliefs. We coined it, not them. And the fact that we cage them with it and suggest that that's them, that somehow, And I was like, oh gosh, that is such a good point. Is we take outrage and umbrage for the things that we create, and we forget that the people involved, they may not even have the structured belief system that we are ascribing to them.
Yeah.
Because we oftentimes forget that the indigenous peoples are made up of countless cultures within themselves, countless beliefs and counter beliefs, countless. Like we could not possibly know all of the derivations of belief structures that go, because I think it gets even more and more direct and small and personal that we just cannot know. And of course,
shouldn't know, because it's
during the colonization period, we kind of destroyed a lot of it, and it's not coming back.
That's very true. Yeah. JT, did you have something to say? I know you tried to interject there.
I don't remember. I don't. Yeah, it's gone. But yeah, no, great episode on the Wendigo.
Yeah, I think it was pretty interesting, and it's just a fascinating period of time, and it's always interesting when paranormal type things pop up in law.
Yeah, absolutely, and that might be a good future episode. Is cases, I think they made a movie out of The Devil Made Me Do It.
Oh yeah, they did.
Just cases where they attempted to use a supernatural defense, and
that would be a good episode,
when it came in, because we even have the story of the woman who ID'd her murderer, and there's actually several of them now. There's several cases where people had dreams where the victim came to them and said, "This is the person who killed me," or things of that nature. So that might be worth a deep dive for a future episode.
And if you want a palate taster, for that episode to come, watch this episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I forget where it was, but you'll look for the woman whose apartment was haunted. Yeah. And she helped solve a murder. It was very loosely unsolved, but it's
it seemed pretty solved.
It seemed pretty solved by the end of it. I believe it's the last or second to last episode of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix. Watch that, and you'll kind of get a nice little taster for what we're talking about. But definitely all those things. And then for all you wondering where episode 2 of Beneath the Cobblestones is, it's coming, and it's coming next month. We are probably going to be filming that in the next week or so when you are hearing this. And so fear not, there will be a second episode coming soon, which is super exciting. But with that, though, my name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And stay spooky, y'all.